Buenas tardes a todos. Acá seguimos en este simposio tan importante de Fundación INECO. Antes que nada, quería a todos quienes estén viendo el simposio por YouTube, les pido por favor que cambien su canal hacia la plataforma, que ya está funcionando correctamente, tal como lo dijo el doctor Torrente, por una cuestión de tráfico. Quizás puede haber algunos inconvenientes, pero todo funciona muy bien al momento, por lo cual ingresen a la plataforma, allí van a tener la posibilidad de recorrer los stands, también van a ver nuestros colaboradores, nuestros sponsors, los stands de Fundación INECO, los cursos que realizamos para la comunidad y para los profesionales. Así que con esto ya damos comienzo a esta nueva sesión. Ahora voy a hablar en inglés y aparte en la plataforma pueden cambiar el idioma, eso es muy importante para quienes quieran escuchar en español la charla de Abigail. Ahora I will speak in English now, since we now listen to Professor Abigail Marsh. Dr. Marsh is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science at Georgetown. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 2004 and conducted her postdoctoral research at the National Institute of Mental Health. Her research on the basis of empathy, altruism, and aggression incorporates functional and structural brain imaging in adolescents and adults, as well as behavioral, cognitive, genetic, and pharmacological techniques. She is also the author of over 80 publications in journals that include proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Nature, Human Behavior, American Journal of Psychiatry, and JAMA Psychiatry, as well as an award-winning trade book about her research on the brain basis of empathy and compassion called The Fear Factor. Her research has received many awards that include the Cosarelli Prize, the CNR Kuno Award for Applied Science for the Social Good, and the Richard Wyatt Fellowship Award for Translational Research. Dr. Marsh's presentation today is Geographical Relationship between Altruism and Well-Being. Very welcome, Dr. Marsh.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll share my screen now so that you can see my slides. Are you able to see my mountain backdrop there? Great. All right, can you see my slides?
Perfect.
Wonderful. All right, so my research related to well-being primarily explores how well-being relates to how well we treat each other, in particular, the links between well-being and prosocial or altruistic behavior. And this line of research actually originated serendipitously, as many lines of research do, I think. My lab was embarking on a new line of research. We, in particular, had picked altruistic kidney donors to study. In some ways, giving your kidney to a stranger is, I think, the ultimate form of altruism and a great way to understand the construct. In an effort to make sure that the sample whose brains we were scanning roughly matched the US population of altruistic kidney donors, and I'll talk about our brain scanning in a moment, we collected data on national statistics on altruistic kidney donors. And one particular statistic that we discovered caught our eye, which is how much more likely these extraordinary altruists are to come from some US states than others. There's a huge per capita difference from the highest to the lowest state. Right around the same time, the Gallup polling organization had come out with its first polling data on well-being across the 50 states as well. And the correspondence between the Gallup map of well-being and our map of per capita altruistic kidney donation was really striking. It was just a massive correlation, as you can see. Obviously, that could have lots of different causes, but we ran a whole series of regression analysis controlling for a ton of other variables and found this really persistent, robust relationship between subjective well-being in particular and this form of extraordinary altruism. This suggests the possibility that when people are flourishing and they have the means to meet their own needs, the likelihood that they will help others also increases. More recently, we've been looking at the relationship between well-being and altruism on a global level. And this was inspired in part by the Charities AIDS Foundation's World Giving Index, which draws on Gallup data to measure 3 different kinds of altruism as they take place around the world. And that includes monetary donations, volunteering, and what they call everyday helping, like giving somebody directions. Couple things to take away from their data are first, that there's a huge amount of variation across countries. In the top ranked countries, something like 4 out of 5 people report having helped a stranger in the last month, whereas in the bottom ranked countries, it's more like 1 out of 5. In addition, you see really impressive stability from year to year because they collect these data every year, which suggests that there may be cultural level, geographic level variables that drive these differences. So we, of course, wanted to know what are these overarching cultural variables that may drive global variation in altruism, and could they be the same as the ones we saw within the US? The first question we wanted to ask is whether this is even a meaningful question. Is variation in altruism even a unitary construct? It might not be. So we first conducted exploratory factor analyses, as well as some other analyses that were aimed at assessing whether Gallup's measures of altruism seem to represent an underarching latent construct. And we also thought it would be a lot more interesting if our findings weren't limited to just these 3 self-report measures using a single item method. So we hunted down, and this took a while, objectively recorded statistics on 4 other divergent forms of altruism, which we defined as any behavior aimed at helping others. The first being living kidney donation, not non-directed or altruistic kidney donation, which is to a stranger, but any kind of living kidney donation, mostly because non-directed kidney donation is so rare, there just aren't statistics across countries. We also looked at marrow donor registration, blood donation rates, and the treatment of non-human animals. And then we calculated the per capita rates when we needed to and normalized all the variables. And the factor analysis we ran yielded 2 factors with all the items loading more strongly on the first. When we forced a 1-factor solution, all the loadings were above 0.5, suggesting a unitary construct. We also ran reliability analyses that showed the same thing. So we calculated overall altruism scores by averaging normalized scores on these individual indices, and looked again at the relationship between altruism and all sorts of different cultural outcomes, including 2 indices of well-being that were collected by Gallup. And just as we'd seen in the US, we found that altruism was associated with both objective indices of well-being, including indices of wealth and health and education. Also, we found that altruism was associated with 2 indices of subjective well-being, including reports of thriving and also average daily emotions that are felt. The linear regressions that we used to follow up these analyses evaluated all the predictors simultaneously and determined that of these covariates that we had identified, as has been seen in prior studies, wealth, again, at the national level, GDP, is the best predictor of altruism. But when we looked at objective well-being plus measures of subjective well-being, like reported thriving, you can see that the thriving corresponds much more closely to altruism. The degree to which people feel that their life is going in a good direction, the degree to which they feel fulfilled and they have a sense of purpose in their life and a sense of connectedness to others. And again, the degree to which people report that they're thriving is a much better predictor of altruism than reported daily emotions, the degree to which people are feeling happy versus sad versus anxious, for example. And this really strong relationship between thriving and altruism holds up when you look at each of the individual forms of altruism as well. And I show this graph mostly because I find it amazing how consistent these patterns are. It doesn't really matter what form of altruism you look at, from charitable donations to donating blood to treating animals well. The more people report that they're thriving, the more altruistically they behave, again, at a geographic level. And I also find this amazing given these data sets are drawn from wildly different sources, and they draw from different subsets of countries depending on which variable we're looking at, and the data collection methods were different. Now, obviously, different geographic regions differ in a whole lot of ways that are not captured by our data. So we also investigated cultural values and language family, which is a rough proxy for cultural similarity because of the way that languages evolve over time. And our results showed that there were some differences in altruism by language family. I won't really get into them. We didn't have any hypotheses, really. We were mostly controlling for these variables. Even after controlling cultural similarity and basic demographic variables, one big predictor of altruism stood out, which was the cultural value of individualism. And this was a positive predictor of altruism. So the more individualist members of a country are reported to be, the higher the level of altruism we tend to find. This, I think it really depends whether you think of this as surprising or not surprising. One reason that you might think of it as not surprising is because individualism has been found to also be a strong predictor of cultural variation and well-being. And we found, in keeping with that individualism both mediated and moderated the relationship between subjective well-being and altruism. So here are the data for thriving, and you can see that beyond the linear relationship between individualism and subjective well-being and altruism, there's also this interaction effect. And when we broke it down, what we found is that in general, for countries who are above the mean of individualism, the relationship between individualism and altruism is the strongest. Again, I think it depends whether this seems like a surprising finding. If it does seem surprising, maybe because I think individualism kind of gets a bad rap as equivalent to selfishness, which is not exactly what it is. Individualism mostly refers to the extent to which the individual, rather than the group, is viewed as the primary unit of society. And so in individualist societies, the emphasis is on pursuing goals and engaging in activities and forming relationships that you want to pursue, that are personally meaningful or important for you, rather than ones that will have a positive impact on your group. I think of individualism actually as the stuff that you see on inspirational greeting cards. Here's a picture I took of a Georgetown University, my university's bookstore greeting card rack. And these cards are just liquid individualism. They're all about following your dreams and reaching your goals and doing what makes you happy. And because individualism is about doing what makes you happy, it is somewhat unsurprising that it seems to be positively associated with well-being. I'm not saying there aren't downsides to individualism, there are, but it suggests that there may be some upsides as well. What it suggests, I think, is that when resources and cultural norms promote the pursuit of personally meaningful goals, the goals that people increasingly strive for include altruistic goals, which I think is really cool, especially because research done by one of my former undergrads at Georgetown, who's I think now a PhD student in Toronto, has shown that individualism is increasing all around the world. And so given that that's true, it's nice to think that it may not be followed by decreases in altruism, but rather the opposite. Now, you might be thinking, well, shoot, all of this must have taken a major nosedive during the current global pandemic, right? We're in a global recession and people are experiencing social isolation and social unrest and death and disease. And, altruism must be an endangered species. I have good news for you, which is that's not necessarily true, although we haven't seen the latest sort of annual well-being numbers, so we don't know for sure. But this may be because acute stress and thriving are not really the same thing. And if you remember, daily emotion, the degree to which people report feeling anxious or sad or happy or whatever, isn't that predictive of altruism. And for many people, positive predictors of altruism, like a sense of meaning and purpose, have actually gone up during the pandemic, at least according to some reports I've seen. So have acute stress and anxiety, but research that I've conducted with my colleague, Joanna Vieira, suggests that acute stress may actually increase altruism. So these are data that were collected by my colleague, again, Joanna Vieira, who's currently a postdoc at the Karolinska Institute. And early in the pandemic, she and I measured the relationship between anxiety and stress and various forms of altruism and prosociality in the real world. And this is just in the US. And her theory is that acute stress and anxiety are activating emotions. And this is consistent with what's been found by, for example, Dean Mobbs and Andreas Olsen, who she's doing her postdoc with. And at the individual level, acute stress and anxiety motivate active self-defense. And emerging evidence suggests that in social contexts, these same emotions may activate people to help others as well. So this may help explain why our study found a very consistent positive relationship between self-reported altruism early in the pandemic. So we don't have data from more recently, but this was over 4 weeks in April, and anxiety and acute threat. We didn't see any similar effect for perceived stress, but that's more low level and chronic. So again, this suggests that the high levels of stress that people are experiencing, while not necessarily good in and of themselves, but that acute anxiety and threat may actually be a positive influence on altruistic behavior, unless well-being levels have dropped as well. So just briefly, this is very consistent with the work that my research lab does, exploring the relationship between fear and altruism at the individual level. And again, we usually find that they're positively related. In brief, most of my work on altruism has looked at the possibility that within a society, the most altruistic people around are the people who occupy the high end of what I've come to call the caring continuum. At the low end of this continuum are people who are psychopathic, who I also study. They are notoriously fearless. They are insensitive to other people's fear and distress, and this is due in part to structural and functional abnormalities in brain regions like the amygdala, which tends to be smaller than average in people who are psychopathic and less responsive. So a few years back, my lab conducted the first ever brain imaging studies of a sample of extraordinary altruists. Again, these were altruistic kidney donors who had given one of their own kidneys away to a stranger, and found that altruistic kidney donors are precisely the opposite of psychopaths. Their amygdalas are larger than that of the average person. They are more responsive to especially signs of others' distress and fear. And as a result, altruists are better at recognizing, they're more sensitive to other people's fear, which again, I think supports a positive relationship between threat sensitivity and altruism. And we hypothesize this is because fear sensitivity makes altruists better at empathizing with other people's fear, and we've confirmed that this is true. From a neural perspective, empathy means the existence of shared neural representations. So it means that my brain is responding the same way when I'm feeling an emotion like fear or pain, and when I'm seeing somebody else experiencing it, which suggests that I am attempting to simulate or share the other person's emotional state on a neural level. And so we wanted to test whether altruists' greater fear sensitivity means that they are better at empathizing with other people's fear and pain. And so to do this, we asked altruistic controls to come into the lab at Georgetown and have their brains scanned while we smashed their thumbnails with this very carefully calibrated plastic device, which is safe but painful. And then we watched from, then the altruists and the controls watched from inside the scanner as a stranger had their thumbs smashed with this device. And the controls showed some level of self-other overlap in brain regions like the anterior insula when they were experiencing pain or fear or watching a stranger experience those emotions. But as we predicted, we saw greater empathic responding, greater self-other neural overlap in altruists in regions like the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex that we know are important for empathy when they were experiencing pain or fear and watching a stranger have those same experiences. And so here you can see the stronger correlation we found between altruist responses when they felt and observed pain in the anterior insula, which again, we know is essential for empathy. If this region was more active when they experienced pain, it was more active when they observed another person's pain, even that pain of a stranger. And it wasn't more active overall for altruists. It just corresponded really well when they had an experience and saw somebody else have the same experience. Now, obviously, any good scientific answer leads to even more questions. And for us, the next obvious question is, why is it that altruists empathize more and better with strangers? And there's lots of parts to that question. But the one we wanted to understand is, what is different in the way that they think about strangers? And in interviewing many, many extraordinary altruists over the years, the conclusion I can't help but draw is that they just care about strangers more. They value even distant others' welfare more than most people do. But the question is, of course, how to test this empirically. The approach we used was called a social discounting task. And this is a measure that asks people to make a series of choices to either keep some amount of resources or split those resources with another person. And the other person could be somebody close to you, like a spouse or a parent, or more distant from you, or even a complete stranger. And we know that for typical people who are making these choices, there's a very steep drop-off in generosity for more distant others. Most people discount the value of resources shared with others, which is why it's called a social discounting curve. What I like about this task is that choices in the task actually kind of map on well to the decision to donate an organ, right? Here's a set of resources that happen to be your own kidneys. Do you want to keep all these resources for yourself, or do you want to split them with a stranger? So given this, we predicted that altruists would discount the value of resources shared with strangers less, meaning that they value strangers' outcomes more. And this is what we found. Compared to the 39 controls we tested, the 20 altruists had a dramatically flattened discounting slope, much flatter than has ever been observed in any other sample anywhere. It's the biggest behavioral difference we've seen between altruists and controls. And we also found that this difference in discounting mediated the group differences in self-reported care. So maybe social discounting is a mechanism by which care can be expanded outward toward even very distant others. And supporting this, more recently, we've been working with a bunch of other different populations of altruists, including a much larger sample of altruistic kidney donors and directed kidney donors, liver donors, bone marrow donors, heroic rescuers, and humanitarian aid workers, many different kinds of altruism. And we find pretty impressively flat discounting curves in all of them. So the last thing I want to tell you about is the personality variable that seems to predict this way of thinking about close versus distant others. And we found that the very flat discounting curve we see in altruists is predicted by one personality trait that distinguishes altruistic controls out of all the many, many personality traits we've now looked at. You might be familiar with the big 5 personality traits. They're very well known. They include emotionality and extroversion and agreeableness. And when we tested all of these personality traits across a group of over 150 altruists and 100 and some controls, we found no consistent differences in any of these big 5 personality traits. But there is a 6th personality trait that's often neglected because once upon a time, the psychologists who were creating personality tests didn't think traits related to morality were psychological. And this trait is honesty, humility. You may know it from the Hexaco measure. And it reflects less of a tendency to value your own welfare more than other people, right? That's what it means to be humble. That's what it means to not be manipulative, to be honest with people, is that you don't view them as tools for, achieving your own means. And what we found is that all of the altruists we tested, all of the groups, each dot here represents an individual and each row stands for a group of altruists, were higher in this trait, honesty, humility, than controls. And the differences in this trait explain the reduced discounting, which we think helps explain their greater empathy. So this appears to be what makes unusual altruists within a society so different, is that they don't think that they're different. They don't think they're more special or more important than anybody else. So the answer to the question of what makes an altruist is, I think, first, that they're thriving, right? And this is often for cultural reasons. Altruists are most likely to come from geographic regions where people are experiencing high levels of well-being, and also, paradoxically, coupled with acute stress. They're also empathic, right? Differences in the structure and function of brain regions like the amygdala increase altruist sensitivity to others' distress, especially fear, and they care for strangers. Altruist empathy is not limited to close others because they value the welfare of even strangers. So, far from the so-called Darwinian view of human nature, compassion and altruism are common outcomes that can be explained by basic social and affective mechanisms in the brain that make some people more responsive than others to people's distress. However, under the right circumstances, there are certain variables that I believe will cause altruism to thrive everywhere, such that the needs and suffering of others may be something that almost everyone can feel altruism and compassion for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marsh. It was a very interesting talk, mainly to understand the relationship between well-being and altruism, and how increased well-being promotes altruism. Altruism promotes well-being also. So thank you very much. And now I will ask you a question. What is the role of nature versus nurture in the altruism debate?
This is such a great question. It's a question I hear a lot, so I'm really glad you asked it. I think it's important to think of altruism as very much like any other human outcome, as influenced by both nature and nurture in interactive ways throughout development. We don't have much good data on it. I will say, first of all, there haven't been big behavioral genetic studies on altruism. There's only one, and it uses self-reported altruism. And it finds that altruism, the variability in this trait is about 50% heritable. That sounds about right. That's similar to most personality variables. In working with the altruistic kidney donors, my experience is that they report that even from a very early age, they were unusually sensitive to other people's distress, unusually oriented towards other people's welfare. But the best thing about altruism is that helping other people tends to be self-reinforcing. Right? We know there's this wonderful reciprocal relationship between altruism and well-being. Well-being tends to promote altruism, but engaging in altruism increases well-being. It's because it's reinforcing, and so it increases as you go. And so I think one of the variables that helps promote altruism in the environment is actually the rewards of engaging in altruism. And so people who start engaging in altruism tend to keep doing more and more of it, and it sort of grows as time goes on. So this is one reason I encourage people to just start. Just try helping people, see where it gets you, and I think you'll find it rewarding enough. You'll probably want to keep doing it.
Okay, thank you very much, Abigail. It was a really pleasure for us to have you here. Ahora ya vuelvo a nuestro idioma español. La próxima exposición y la próxima mesa la presentará la licenciada Fernanda Giralfont. Ella es coordinadora del área de bienestar, subdirectora del Departamento de Psicoterapia de INECO y es la coordinadora científica de este simposio. Fer, todo tuyo.